Picture a 14,000-year-old human skeleton. Not from some remote, ancient chapter of our story. 14,000 years ago, people elsewhere on Earth were already tending the first crops, building permanent settlements, painting elaborate scenes on cave walls in France and Spain. So when miners quarrying limestone in southwest China broke into a cave in 1989 and found human remains inside, nobody expected what those bones would eventually reveal. Thick, heavy-set skulls. Flat, broad faces. Wide, low-bridged noses. Small, receding chins that barely projected forward at all. Prominent ridges of bone arching over deep-set eyes. On their own, laid out for comparison, those features read like a textbook description of Homo erectus, or perhaps Homo habilis, human relatives who vanished from the fossil record hundreds of thousands of years before anyone alive today's most distant ancestors even existed. And yet radiocarbon dating placed these particular bones at somewhere between 14,500 and 11,500 years old. Recent. Startlingly, almost impossibly recent for a skeleton wearing this particular combination of features. The cave earned its name from another set of fossils found scattered throughout its sediment, the bones of an unusually large, now extinct species of red deer, clearly hunted and eaten by whoever had once sheltered there. Red Deer Cave. Malyadong, in the local language. A name that sounds almost gentle for what turned out to be one of the strangest, most persistently unresolved puzzles in the entire study of human origins, a mystery that, remarkably, still doesn't have a confirmed answer, even after more than 3 decades of dedicated research by multiple international teams. Strangely, almost nobody looked closely at these bones for nearly 2 decades after they were pulled from the ground. The fossils were carefully catalogued, stored away in a regional museum collection in Yunnan province, and largely left untouched until 2008, when an international team of Chinese and Australian researchers finally began a proper, detailed examination. What they found waiting for them, essentially frozen in storage for 20 years, was a genuinely rare kind of scientific gift, a set of remains representing at least 3 to 5 separate individuals, preserved well enough to reveal a consistent, repeated pattern of traits rather than one strange outlier. This wasn't a single unusual skeleton that could be dismissed as an anomaly, a birth condition, or a fluke of preservation. Multiple individuals, from the same population, all showing the same unexpected combination, unmistakably archaic skull architecture, paired with a genuinely recent radiocarbon date. Picture what daily life actually looked like for these people, hidden away in the folds of Yunnan's dramatic limestone karst country, a landscape of steep, fog-wrapped peaks, dense subtropical forest, and hidden river gorges, a genuinely isolated pocket of terrain tucked between the lowlands of Southeast Asia and the rising edge of the Tibetan Plateau. The cave sediment itself told part of the story before any bone analysis even began: layers of ash from repeated campfires, the burned and butchered remains of red deer and other game, alongside tools carefully shaped from deer antler. This was a population living a full, resourceful, socially organized existence, hunting cooperatively, working raw materials into functional tools, gathering around fire night after night in a landscape that had sheltered people, in one form or another, for a very long time. The 2008 examination confirmed something the initial 1989 excavators had only suspected: this really was an unusually consistent set of archaic-looking features, distributed across multiple individuals, at a date that placed them firmly within what should have been an entirely modern human population. By 2012, the lead investigators had gone public with a genuinely bold proposal, that these individuals might represent a previously unknown, extremely late surviving population of archaic humans, one that had somehow persisted in this isolated corner of southwest China long after every other archaic human lineage on the planet had already vanished. It was a claim that invited serious scrutiny, and it deserved that scrutiny. Extraordinary anatomical claims about a single, geographically isolated site require an unusually high bar of evidence before the wider field accepts them. But the geography itself offered a plausible explanation for why, if true, this particular corner of the world might have been exactly the kind of place where something like this could happen. The dramatic uplift of the nearby Tibetan Plateau, over millions of years, had carved southwest China into an extraordinarily varied, biogeographically complex landscape, steep valleys, isolated pockets of forest, dramatically different microclimates packed close together within a relatively small area. It's exactly the kind of fragmented, isolated terrain that, in other branches of the animal kingdom, has repeatedly allowed unusual, relict populations to survive in isolated refuges long after their relatives elsewhere went extinct. Whether that same principle applied to an actual human population remained, at this stage, a genuinely open and contested question. In 2015, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. A team led by Darren Curnow and Ji Shuoping published a detailed study of a previously overlooked partial leg bone from the same site, one that had sat unstudied in that same museum collection for over 25 years. The proportions were genuinely startling: a narrow shaft, a thin outer bone layer, reinforced regions consistent with an unusually primitive gait pattern, and overall dimensions that matched species like Homo habilis and early Homo erectus far more closely than they matched any modern human population, ancient or otherwise. One of the researchers involved noted, with evident excitement, that this single bone alone had an incredible story still left to tell after decades sitting quietly ignored. It also deepened an already difficult set of questions. Who exactly were these people? Why would a population showing this particular set of archaic features have survived this late, and why specifically here, tucked into the folds of tropical southwest China, when nowhere else on the planet showed anything remotely similar at such a recent date? Around the same time, researchers began paying closer attention to a second, nearby site, Longlin Cave, sometimes called Laomakeo Cave, which had initially been grouped together with the Malyadong remains under the same Red Deer Cave People label. Closer study eventually suggested these might actually represent two related but genuinely distinct populations, with the Longlin individual looking increasingly like a possible hybrid between fully modern humans and whatever unusual population the Malyadong bones represented. For years, the question hung there largely unresolved, waiting for a technology capable of settling it definitively. That technology arrived in the form of ancient DNA sequencing. By 2022, a team had successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material from the Malyadong remains, and the results seemed, at first glance, to finally answer the central question. Genetically, these individuals were fully modern Homo sapiens, no different, at the genetic level, from other populations living across East Asia during the same broad period. More specifically, their DNA showed a close connection to ancestral East Asian lineages, and even carried signatures linking them to the deep ancestry of Native American populations, whose own ancestors trace back through exactly this general region and time period. It seemed, for a while, like a tidy resolution, not a surviving archaic species after all, simply an unusually distinctive-looking population of otherwise completely modern humans, carrying an unusual combination of physical traits within the normal range of human genetic variation. Case closed, more or less, except that the underlying anatomical puzzle never actually went away. Being genetically modern doesn't automatically explain why a population would display skull proportions, brow ridges, and limb architecture more reminiscent of species that had gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years earlier. The DNA answered one question. It left an equally important one sitting right where it had always been. And then, in 2025, the ground shifted again. A separate team examining the original 2022 genomic data identified evidence of contamination significant enough to genuinely call the earlier interpretation into question. Contamination in ancient DNA work is a persistent, well-known hazard. Modern genetic material, from researchers, from lab equipment, from centuries of handling, can easily mix with fragile ancient samples and distort the resulting analysis if it isn't caught and corrected for properly. That doesn't necessarily mean the 2022 conclusion was wrong. It means the confidence behind it needs to be reassessed, and the door that had seemed firmly closed swung back open, at least partially. Around the same time, a separate reanalysis of that unusual 2015 leg bone reached a notably different conclusion than the original study had, arguing that its proportions actually fell within the range seen in other short, robust human populations from the same broad period, rather than pointing toward anything genuinely archaic. Two competing reanalyses, examining two separate pieces of the same overall puzzle, arriving at two different conclusions within roughly a year of each other. That's not a sign of sloppy science. It's exactly what a genuinely difficult, still unresolved question looks like from the inside, before enough evidence has accumulated to settle it one way or the other for good. So where does that leave the Red Deer Cave people today, heading into 2026? Genuinely, honestly unresolved, which is a rarer and more interesting place for a scientific mystery to sit than a tidy, wrapped-up answer would be. The skull shapes and brow ridges remain undeniably unusual, distinctive enough that multiple independent teams, working with different methods across more than a decade, have all flagged them as genuinely anomalous rather than simply misidentified or exaggerated. The genetic evidence pointing toward fully modern ancestry remains broadly compelling, even with the contamination concerns factored in, though it no longer carries quite the same air of absolute certainty it briefly held in 2022. And the leg bone sits exactly where competing interpretations left it, either a striking archaic holdover, or simply an unusual but explainable variation within known human diversity, depending on which reanalysis you find more persuasive. What nobody currently disputes is the underlying strangeness of the population itself, people living ordinary, resourceful lives in the misty karst hills of Yunnan, hunting red deer, working antler into tools, gathering around cave fires each night, while carrying a physical appearance that, laid next to the wrong comparison chart, might convince you they'd walked straight out of a chapter of human history that had supposedly closed hundreds of thousands of years before they were ever born. There's a genuinely important, broader lesson tucked inside this ongoing back and forth, one that goes well beyond a single cave in southwest China. The boundary we draw between archaic and modern humans has always been somewhat artificial, a convenient shorthand built from the fossils we happen to have access to at any given moment, rather than a hard, universal biological line drawn cleanly through the past. The Red Deer Cave people are a genuinely useful reminder that human physical diversity, even within our own species, was almost certainly far wider and stranger than the relatively narrow, well-studied fossil record from Europe and parts of Africa has led most people to assume. Southwest China's rugged, fragmented, biodiverse terrain, shaped over millions of years by the slow uplift of the Tibetan Plateau, may well have functioned as a genuine refuge for unusual physical variation, allowing traits that had disappeared everywhere else on the planet to persist quietly in one isolated pocket of forest and limestone, largely undisturbed, for far longer than anyone would have predicted. It's worth sitting honestly with the fact that this video doesn't end with a clean answer, because the actual science genuinely hasn't produced one yet. That's not a failure of the researchers involved, G. Shueping, Darren Curnow, and the many collaborators who have worked on this material across nearly 2 decades have each added real, careful pieces to an unusually difficult puzzle. It's simply an honest reflection of where a still active scientific question currently stands. New techniques keep arriving. Ancient DNA extraction keeps improving. Every year brings tools capable of asking sharper questions of the same fragile, 30-year-old bones sitting in that Yunnan museum collection. The Red Deer Cave people may eventually get a fully settled explanation, one way or another. For now, they remain something genuinely rarer in this field, an open case, still being actively argued over by serious researchers, with real stakes for how broadly we're willing to define what modern human actually means. So here's where this particular story leaves you, and it's an unusual place for a documentary like this one to land. No tidy resolution. No final reveal. Just a genuinely strange population of people who lived ordinary lives in a spectacular, isolated corner of ancient China, hunting deer and raising children and tending fires exactly like countless other human communities across that same time period, while wearing a physical appearance that, even now, keeps refusing to fit neatly into any box science has built for it. Which part of this actually sticks with you the most? That a fully modern-dated skeleton could carry brow ridges and skull proportions more typical of species that vanished hundreds of thousands of years earlier, that the supposedly settled 2022 genetic answer just got reopened by a contamination finding in 2025, or that this remains a genuinely unsolved mystery in a field that usually manages to explain its way to a confident conclusion? Drop your theory below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the mysteries this field still hasn't managed to close.